All right, then. Hello again to another session. ZK Ask the Expert. Today about ZK and testing. We had this topic already a year and a half ago, roughly. I think you see the old zip file here. 2020 was my last update. I think 2019 was the last meeting we had. The topics will mostly be the same today. I'll have a few small changes in here, so you will maybe see something new as well if you have already joined the previous session. Otherwise, I think it's a good reminder and also good to know that things still work. I'm Robert from the ZK support team. I think you know me already, don't need to introduce a lot. I think we just get started. So today we're talking about ZATS and TestCafe, and maybe slightly about a few other test tools that go along with it or that don't work well. Just mention a few things so you maybe can avoid a few dead ends in case you are planning to do testing. We have a few recommendations. Oh, someone is drawing on the screen. Okay, no problem. There's a clear button if you don't want this. Wait, let's see where I can I clear? Okay, now it's gone again. Okay, so yes, you can also point out with a little arrow icon if you want to point me to some line of code if I'm stuck. But I will just close this. So when we want to do testing, when we want to test ZK, there's always several challenges. The major problem is, I think that most of you are already encountered if you're interested in testing, that ZK generates these non-unique ID. So many frameworks don't work automatically or work in a very difficult way, because you would have to implement your own ID generator, and generating non-unique or generating unique IDs that are also stable between tests is not too trivial. And since there are other ways of testing ZK or other ways of selecting components, I would prefer to just introduce these ways because they work better with ZK and don't require to change the ID generation. If ID generation is a large topic, let us know in the support. We can also help there, but it's just complicated and right now not necessary for these test tools. So when you want to test, you always ask yourself the question, which tool to choose? And luckily, there are not too many options. So anything that is not, or these arrows just indicate what you should prefer over the next one in case you can already test it without the other tools. So if you can test anything with JUnit purely, go for it. Any kind of non-UI code is best tested in isolated unit tests, because there you can write many test cases that run quickly and don't rely on the UI at all. All your services, all your bean objects and classes or utilities or whatever you use JUnit as much as possible. Since we also use JUnit directly in ZATS, I will not introduce it separately here. It's the default JUnit and with all the tools that go along with it. Then if you need to test a part of your application, for example, a specific composer in combination with a Zool file or a view model with a Zool file, then the tool of choice is ZATS, because ZATS will only test your application logic. It does not simulate the browser. It does not run any JavaScript. It only tests the server side, but with the advantage that the tests are running quite fast. So you can run lots of tests. During development, it's Java code that compiles and debugs nicely. And you also have full insight on all the component tree and the component state of your current ZK page. So if you need this kind of insight, or you want to test a partial page, use ZATS. For integration tests, classically we use Selenium, but nowadays TestCafe seems a bit easier to maintain, in my opinion. For example, for this test project here, I just upgraded all the version and things just continued to work. which happened rarely to me with when using Selenium in the past. Somehow it always something broke when browser versions change. And with that, it was just run the same thing again. It works. Updated the updated TestCafe. It still works. So I'm quite happy with this tool, and it offers a I think if you do browser testing anyway, a better interface because it's already executing in JavaScript. So you have direct insight into what's running in the browser. And it also has nice debugging features, which I will demonstrate. And then what we all what you also can use as a testing tool for load testing is JMeter. It's not ideal, it's not perfect. So I would only use it as little as possible or as little as necessary, because these tests in JMeter tend to break very quickly. So the maintenance effort is high. So basically, before every test run, you have to record the tests again and run them multiple times. But if you make large-scale tests on larger servers or on server clusters or whatever, maybe that's a way to go if you need to do load testing at all. Other tests, Load Runner, I think, do something similar. So the rules are always the same. And it's just too complicated for this talk today. Just one thing to remember, when you use these kind of load tests, don't forget to remove the desktop. And if you don't know what this means, ask us in the support. Because if you don't remove the desktops in your test cases, you will be just introducing large memory leaks, making your test cases completely pointless. You're just testing the worst DOS attack then, and not a regular load test or load case. Just to mention. Otherwise, contact us. It's not always easy, but sometimes necessary. Okay, let's start with that. As always, I have a small demo project. I use some kind of embedded jetties to run this locally, or embedded Tomcat. Today, I use the profile jetty to run this project locally. What we have is the typical Maven project structure: source main Java, source main web app. And for our testing classes, source test Java, source test resources. And in here, we have our Zool files. We have some configuration files. The ZK config is empty, so there's just the default config. And the web XML just introduces the default servlets. So nothing special in here. That's just our application. And if we run this, we can pick our run config. It should just run. We just look into it quickly in the browser so we can see what we can expect, what we want to test, and then we look into the first test case. And when I switch my Maven profiles, my class path changes slightly, so a few test classes don't compile anymore. Need to find a better way to isolate the class paths. That's a bit easier with Gradle, but here I used Maven. Okay, server started. And we have a browser here. We refresh the browser window and the server is running. We see the index of all the files, for example, the hello Zool, a simple file with the text input. I type some text, I click a button, and something changes in the page. Or if I reload the page, the counter will increment. That's some kind of session state that might be worth testing, just to see that pages change over time. Okay, if we go back, now we have a hello and we have a by page. I have an included page now that shows a few parameters that are passed into an include. I'll demonstrate how to test this. There's a parent that's loading an include dynamically based on parameters we type. I see the parameters will go in to the included file. We have a shadow element case, which is very, very simple, just to show how to select a specific kind of component, and one that's demonstrating how to mock services. Here it doesn't run because I didn't even set up an application context for Spring, so it will just fail because I don't have any Spring set up in the project. But the test case will mock the object, and then we will see how how we can work with mock objects instead of Spring. Yeah, instead of Spring services directly. So I just assume the application works, but you want to test without all your database config. You just want mock objects. Okay, so pages are very simple, so we can keep within the time limit we have. We stop our testing server, and from now on we will just run the test cases with the JUnit runner inside the IDE. So for example, we have I have a few other things to mention. So in this case, just a WAR file for Spring Boot. If you have a Spring Boot object, also too much to cover today, but there you can't have both with ZATS and Spring Boot, because ZATS is embedding its own Jetty, and Spring Boot is trying to embed a Tomcat or a Jetty, but only one can run at a time, and ZATS will use its own one, and it can't connect to another server, because with ZATS everything is running in the same virtual machine process, so you have access to all the live objects of the server in your test case. And if this was an external server, you couldn't access the objects like this in this detail. So if you need to run a Spring Boot object, there is a test case here in this link that mentions how to configure the test web XML, and or there's a full example in this. Oh, wait, there's cars driving by. Yeah, there's a full runnable example for Spring and Spring Boot. So don't try to run Spring yourself, then you can't use ZATS. ZATS will run its own server, but you can initialize Spring from both a boot runnable class and from a web XML. So there are alternatives how to run the Spring Boot application. So not the other way around. Don't try to run ZATS with Spring Boot. Just run Spring Boot inside ZATS in the way that works. And that's the example. Or contact our support. I think we can also help with specific cases if there's a problem. Okay, so what we do is, in order to configure ZATS, we need to add, of course, a Maven dependency. Here in this project, I have my a Maven profile. So this, or I separated the profile because the embedded Jetty and the ZATS, they both have a Jetty dependencies. So I can pick either one of the two. So right now I don't care about the Jetty profile. We only care about the ZATS profile, and I added the ZATS mimic, which is our library. Somehow we stopped counting at 7. There are currently no breaking features, so you can still use this with the latest version ZK 9.5. And JUnit, I just upgraded to the latest version 4.13.1 because there was some kind of vulnerability. JUnit 5, we don't have any specific supporting classes for JUnit 5 yet. If this is a large topic, let us know. Maybe we have to integrate or provide some helper classes for JUnit 5, if this is a topic. Right now, we didn't hear about the demand yet. Okay, so that's why it's isolated. I switched the profiles. It will then switch the class, update the class path of the project, and my test cases should then be able to compile. Yeah, the red lines go away, and we start with the. Well, that's all you need. You just add ZATS, and you add your testing library of your choice. And for JUnit, we have a few supporting cases, supporting configuration rules. But you can also use testng. In the end, it doesn't matter. You can run ZATS from a runnable main class. It doesn't matter. You initialize ZATS. You use the ZATS API to simulate the request, and JUnit just does the same thing in the JUnit framework. What was the first test? Yeah, so what I recommend when using ZATS, at least have some kind of page smoke test for every ZUL file or every entry page you want to have in your application, just to have a quick test that doesn't need to have any interaction, just to see that the Zool file runs, and if it configures any kind of controller classes or view models, that all these classes exist in your project and the page can render. And these tests are very cheap to build. You just specify a list of URLs and just let them render. And just by rendering these URLs, you know that all of these pages, all of these URLs will render without failing at server side. So for example, if we just run this test, then I will go through the steps what this one is doing. Just see that this one is executing as expected. Building, 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 and it's running smoke test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, and everything's green. So what this does is it uses the class rule auto environment to specify where our web app is in our source code. And it has the auto client rule that will execute before every test case to create a new client. A client object is like a browser session. It will be a new session ID. It's like a user connecting to a browser. Don't try parallel tests or concurrent tests. In ZATS, you can only run one test at a time per VM. There are some static objects that don't allow parallel tests here. So don't try this. It's not a load testing tool. Don't do this. It will just produce undefined behavior. So I'm running all these 5 in a sequence. And all I do is I connect to the URL. And if there was something wrong on one of these pages, it would already break. For example, if we had a tiny syntax error here in this page, well, just maybe something there. And we run the test again. I'll just click here. Instantly, our page test fails. Even though here the IDE would tell us that there's a problem, but it will complain about any kind of components that don't exist. Now we should get component doesn't exist exception or component definition not found. Yeah, definition not found exception. So these are the easy problems you can capture very easily. And if you have one of these tests for every Zool file you render or you have in your application, then whenever it's included with the default parameters, you will at least be sure it parses and it runs. So that's very cheap, a cheap way of testing. Of course, all the pages have some kind of state. So you will at some point want to test a bit more. We'll get to this, how to test and include with parameters or with outer dependencies of other Zool files. This can be mocked and simulated. So if we go to the page smoke test the end here, I'm just using the parameters annotation of JUnit to iterate over a list and call this method for each URL once. Easy every time. And if you need more pages to test, I just created one new test, the depending main.zool. I've forgotten to include it in the list. Just see if this one will also test my new test case, depending /main.zool. Compiling, 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 parsing Java, and run again. And now we should see 6 test cases. Yeah, and each of these 6 test cases failed, succeeded. So you see that the test cases run quite quickly. The first one takes a bit longer because it has to start the Jetty and parse the configuration. And here the caches, I think, are getting hot. And then subsequent tests are quite quick. So you can easily add a long list of tests that don't take a long time to run compared to browser tests, which always take a bit longer until the JavaScript engine has executed everything. So here for server-side logic, this is ideal to use these tests. What do we have? So we have the page render smoke test. And then of course we want to test a few interactions, and we want to make sure that also the content of the pages is correct, that they're not only syntactically correct and parse and initialize, but also to see that we actually have something on the test. So I have my hello, I think a hello by test. Just use this one. So the hello by test. Now, for example, I have a few asserts here just to see that after I'm connecting to the page, I want to make sure that I really am on the page hello.zul and not being redirected somewhere else. I want to test that, for example, a window title has a specific string. I want to test that some of my text boxes and some of my buttons exist in my page. And in order to find them, I find it quite helpful to generate a selector function, so that you will, whenever you try to find a specific component on a page, you always call the same method, and it will return the component at this moment in time. So you don't have a stale instance from a previous invocation of this method. So you always get a fresh version of this one from the current component tree. So your assertions are always fresh. So the next time you assert, here I assume it's not null. Here I want to say it is null. So I just query for this object again. The queries or the query API is quite simple. So whenever you connect to a Zul file, you get a desktop agent, and all these kind of agent objects are these wrappers around ZK objects that let you either get the original object or which have some convenience methods to invocate common operations or also specific events on these objects. Like here, a click operation or input some text. These are some default interaction agents. So the selection API. Each agent has a query method, and with the query method, you can select components by ZK component IDs. So you don't need to use unique IDs in a browser. You don't depend on these. You can just specify your own component IDs in your Zul file. For example, my hello Zul specifies an ID here. And these components are available because they are available at server side, and as we see later, also at client side. So we don't depend on the DOM IDs because they're generated. And it's good to test ZK works with the generated DOM IDs so that you don't have different version of ZK running in the test environment and the live system. So you can just test the same code. So I can find a window by ID. Now the syntax is like CSS selectors. You just find this one by ID. I can find nesting levels. I find the your name component or the your name text box inside the main window. I can find the button just by its ID itself. I can find by CSS classes even if I want to. I can select by attribute selection, so I can select something by label. So if you don't want to give IDs, you can just check, is there a button with this label? Yeah. Or you can combine these. You search for a specific component type and an ID. So very similar to CSS. And that's how you build your test case. What I did on top here is I created a few helper functions which you maybe can follow and use a similar pattern. I have my ZATS assert, so I recommend you build your own testing functions that help you find or test for specific conditions you need to test. Now, for example, I wanted to test I'm on a specific page. So I'm asserting that my current desktop agent get request path is a specific path. So I'm just condensing all these ugly API calls into a nice assertion API. I search for component visibility. Assert visible is my function that will test, is this a component, is it visible? Otherwise, if not visible, fail. And then, for example, I have another one. I assert a specific label. I just test, is it a label class? Then is it a label component? I'll just check the label, the value directly. And if it's a label image element, I check the get label function. So this is the testing directly the component API of ZK's components. And if you have another component that has a label, you can just extend the list and check for a different type. And the component agent has this is function to let you check whether it's a specific component or class type. So quite handy in this area. And where do we go? I wasn't hello test. Yeah. So here I'm testing. I'm on the page. I test for something. I test for visibility or for existence of specific components. I also test for my session counter. The session counter is a bit special because I'm really getting the session. I'm looking into the session object and get a session attribute. So that's something you can't do with other test tools in the browser, because you need to go directly into the live objects. So it's quite handy if you need to assert that maybe a logged in user is stored correctly in a session attribute, or that a logged user was successfully removed from a session, or that there's I don't know, any kind of information inside the session or other internal objects. So highly recommended to use this for these scenarios. So you don't need to output a specific label somewhere just to test it. Just go to the object directly. Now you don't need to change the application to get to the internals. And you can even use reflection if something is not public. There's always a dirty way to test even more. Yeah, then I use the input function to input text into an input field. I click a button, test for UI changes. Same again. Here I'm testing for redirects, which is a special thing I will come back to later. This is a way of extending ZATS. If you need to test for some features that is not yet in ZATS. In the last session, I was planning, or I don't know, kind of intending to make this a real feature in ZK in ZATS, but somehow I haven't gotten back to it, and there has been no request. So it's in my list of things to do, but it hasn't had the highest priority yet. So far, the redirect handling is still in this project I will provide to you. So it's just source code. There is this redirect handler. So it's another class rule that will wrap around ZATS and capture redirects after specific buttons. So you can also test the page flow. Yeah, clicking buttons, assert fault. I think this is all default tests. And then there's isolated tests, just checking the buy button here, test specific redirect flow, how to go between hello, buy, expect and follow redirect is a method that will check whether or not there is a redirect. And if there's one, follow it. And if there's no redirect, just fail. Yeah, I'm testing that all desktops are alive or not. So I here test that the old desktop is dead. So I'm really expecting the old desktop to be removed successfully after a redirect. So it's testing that resources are cleaned up. And then you could go into the session and see if something has been removed from the session after clicking a logout button. That's quite handy if you put this somewhere here after the redirect. Well, these tests run. So if we change something, for example, we say I want to be on hello 2.0 because maybe I have a typo. Then I think the wrong test is running. I'll stop this one. I just run this test. How to run the whole class? Here, hello by test, run hello by test. Yeah, the test hello fails, and it tells me expected hello 2, actual was hello. So I know that my test case also fails if there's something wrong. Same with labels. One more example. I think you know what this means, how this works. We've seen this before. Testing. Test hello by. And now we get a different error message says here there's something wrong. Okay, let's continue a bit. So this was a very simple test case. So we've seen how to interact easily with a few components, how to assert components. For interactions, there are a few more interactions available. I hope I have a test case with more complicated ones. or maybe we check, we just go into the hello by test. So if there are other tests, for example, we just use one, the hello, say your name text box, your name text box.s. And here you can specify what you want to cast this into. And then there are several agent classes in ZK. Here we have a desktop agent. And where are the other ones? I think I just try click agent, and then we go into the interface in the source code directly here. Click agent is of course, a simple one. If we go to the class, you see there's other functions like right click, double click. If you need to simulate these kind of events, now you can just cast your button agent or a component agent into a click agent, and then you have more options. And you see there are several of these, like focus agent, drag agent, check agent. Some are really just simple. I think there is something more complex, maybe upload agent. If you need to upload something, you can simulate the upload starting and the finish of the upload. Sorting, I don't know. Didn't use sorting agent ever. Render agent, paging agent. If you need to move to a page, multiple selection. So there are several of these interfaces you can cast to, and then there's a specific implementation for this. And it's possible to extend this and create your own agents. If needed, let me know. It's not completely simple always, but if we look into the implementation of one of these, you will see what it does. Yeah, it will do this kind of thing here, and then it will implement these methods, and in the end, fire an update. And the post update method in this case will, I think, here fire the actual select event to the server. So it will not, it will still go into the, I wonder where it goes. I never went through this in this detail, but it just sends the event to the server, and then the component will treat it as if it was received by a network request from a user in the browser, just without the browser. And you can
Hello,
post.
Robert.
Yes.
Robert?
Yes.
Yes. Are there any option to test the performance of the page?
To do what?
To test the performance of the page.
The performance.
Yep.
I mean, you can always measure the time it takes, but with ZATS, it's not ideal because ZATS, the test framework, and the server are running in the same process. So whatever you're running will affect the other one. So you can maybe check that rendering a Zool file will be finished after a certain amount of time, and fail your test if it takes longer. But it's not for load testing. For load testing, I mentioned earlier, tools are more complicated and not as convenient. So maybe you have a server farm to test multiple browsers at the same time. That is maybe more realistic, because ZATS does not test how long it takes to download JavaScript. It doesn't test how long it takes to render at client side. So all this is part of the is part of the performance test. So ZATS is really for isolated testing the server-side logic, but you can test a lot with ZATS already. So for performance, it's not ideal, or I think not even meant to be used for performance testing. But you will see if something takes really, really long, your test case will also take really, really long. And then you maybe notice in your test runs that something degraded your performance. But it's not the main purpose of this tool. So maybe I skip over because the time is advanced a lot. I'll just show a few more things from my notes. I always, because this partial testing is maybe more interesting if you have Zool files that are included that need parameters. There is a special way to connect to a page. What we've seen earlier was the connect to page. Where was this? Here we connect to Zool file. This is just loaded without parameters. But if you want to test an include and pass in include parameters, there is this include test. And here is testing a file with page with or this one is what we've seen earlier. We have this form, we output something, or we input some values into our form. We click a button, and then we check that our included page will render the elements correctly. But instead of rendering both pages at the same time, because here we're testing the parent, we just want to test the included ZOOL. Now the included ZOOL is maybe just the result of something. We don't want to simulate all the clicks to get to the result. We just want to pass in the parameters and see that this file is rendering correctly, just displaying the parameters without any logic. Now we have these arc params that are just displayed in this kind of partial ZOOL file. We can use the connect as included method, which allows you to render a ZOOL file or specify a ZOOL file and pass in parameters as a map. So you don't have to simulate all the user interaction if you just want to test the output. So it's quite handy if you have many smaller parts of your application that you want to test without the rest of your application around them. And also, if they depend on session attributes, you can set session attributes before all this. If you have a session already, you can set these and they will be rendered in the page if they depend on the session scope. So that's the easy case. The advanced case is if your included page depends on other pages around them. You still want to test them in isolation or a bit in isolation. Maybe a page around it contains something that's very hard to mock, like a heavy database query or something that you don't want to start up. You don't even want to render it. You don't want to see this. You just want to see that your partial page is rendering. For example, here's my main page, and it has maybe a navigation component that is, I've seen this in real life applications, that includes directly say, give me the main div, give me the main nav div, and I want to send an event to it directly. And then this include can't render by itself because it depends on the main div. So the include itself has a composer, and when this button is clicked in the composer, it maybe directly says, give me the main nav div, and I want to post an event there. It's not a perfect scenario, but sometimes you can't rearrange everything easily, and you want to just also test this page or this partial include in isolation of everything around it. Also to speed up the test cases, so you don't have to set up so many other parameters, just the ones that are needed for this page. You can use something I just made up for this topic today. Yeah, if we click the button, if we click the button directly, it will fail. I think we'll just demonstrate how it fails. I already made the test case expect a failure, so we comment this out so that this test case will instantly run. And fail. Yeah. So here we see it will complain that it cannot post an event because the target is null. Because in our composer, it's trying to get something that doesn't exist if you only render the include by itself. It doesn't know about its surroundings. It's anyway not recommended design, but I've seen this a lot, so can't always change it, and you still want to test something. Someone was sneezing. Yes, and for this case, for this scenario, you can, and this is just to show you that this is possible. You don't say you have to do this always, but it's possible to create components directly from a test. So if this button click depends on the main nav we just created in our test case. And that's why I created the test util setup page manually method. It's a bit hacky, but it does help in this case, because we can only add components to a page inside the ZK application. So you can't go directly in your ZATS test case and say div.append child. It will just fail and say you're not in an active execution, can't add components without a lock to the desktop. And that's why you have to post an event into the ZK application, and inside the event listener, you can then add new components. So that's what this setup page manually does. Now you pass in the client object. I just create some kind of dummy Zool file, so you can just do inline Zool code to generate the smallest possible diff, just a diff, and nothing else. And what I do is I append an event listener to this diff. Now on test init, just my custom event, and then I will use the AU agent, which lets me paste any event to the server. So I just post an event directly to this component. And inside the event on test init listener, I can then create new components. Here I'll just call my callback, my callback from my test case. And that's why I have this lambda here, just passing in the lambda. So when the page is there, you create your own components that we need as a context, because it somehow depends on this one. And then I include my include. Then I create the components of my depending include. And now when this one is asking for the main nav, it will find it. It's a rare case, just showing it's possible to build up these scenarios. And if, for example, in the real case, the main nav was very heavy to compose and to create and to mock, because you need your navigation data from your database. And maybe you only want to test that when you click the button, that this one receives an on navigate event and don't care about the rest. And then you can also add an event listener to this one and just change data of your test class. So you click your button and then you expect that your button has been clicked in the end. So it's a bit twisted. It's not very nice, but possible. And if there's a special case, also get back to us. Don't get stuck for too long. This is requires a bit of internal knowledge, but I wanted to give something new today that I've used a few times in real life projects where there was no other way to efficiently test without rewriting or refactoring the whole application. Because often you want the tests before refactoring. You want to see the application works before you do heavy changes. So that's a way to have a test case for a small part of the application without everything else. Oh, someone doesn't see the screen sharing. Is this true? Is screen sharing broken? Okay, please try, maybe try to reconnect. I'll just talk a bit more slowly. Okay, thanks for the confirmation. Okay, good. So this was the partial pages. The set advanced case, sometimes needed or often needed if you have a legacy application. You want to test first before you want to touch it. That's a way to test parts of it without everything. And if these tests only depend on one or a few core components that should be on every page, you can just mock them out, just create these in your test case directly, and then the rest can run and doesn't fail on specific event listeners. Redirects. For redirects, I already mentioned there is this. I added this redirect handler. This is also this is, for example, this is one example of a ZATS. How to say, customization. So you can add different response handlers. Here I have my response handler that is watching for redirects. Don't know where it checks for the status redirect. Somewhere, extract redirect, filter response, redirect equals response get command. So if there's a redirect command, it will get the data of this command, which contains the URL. It's not about 302 the redirects, it's about ZK redirect commands, which are a JavaScript instruction for the browser to switch to another page. And with this kind of extension, you can follow these automatically. Not automatically, you can, wait, does it automatically? And let me see. I think you could do both, but I want to give a manual choice here in the hello by test. So click, assert. Here's a redirect flow. So here I will follow the redirect manually. So I check if it has a redirect, and if it has a redirect, I will follow the redirect, check the old desktop is gone, and assume there's no other redirect in the response. So redirect handling is sometimes helpful if you need to test a login flow. Or a ZK implemented login flow. If you have a login implementation that goes outside of the ZK application, of course, you don't need to test it from within ZK. This is something you test in the browser because it's integration of different frameworks. Or you just mock the login user so you don't have to log in with every test case. Because you can just set values directly in the session. You don't need to go through the login test every time. And you want to be faster executing your test cases. Okay, separate mock config. So if you have, for example, like the first, we had this test case that the page that failed because I didn't set up Spring yet. I don't have any Spring dependencies. And the Spring dependencies are added to ZK via a variable resolver. And you can add any number of variable resolvers. So I'm just using one that returns a mock object. Here's my test config. So I go in source test resources, and I add a ZK XML here, and just configure my variable resolver globally only for my tests, not for my production. So I don't have any accidental mocks in the production code because this is only the test resource. And the mock variable resolver here is very simple. It just checks if it's requesting the name of my service, then I return a mock instance of my service. I just implement the interface and return some static test data here. So very easy way of how to say providing mock data on top of a Spring context or whatever you don't want to start up in your test case, because it maybe takes a long time to load the database or connect to a web service. And maybe you don't have a connection to the web service, and then you have to mock another server and all these. It's much easier if you can keep the data static, or maybe even depending on parameters. No one is stopping you from implementing the get data with the parameter. If your service requires query parameters, you just add a mock function for those. And the test case then doesn't even know anything about it. The test case will just, where is the service test case here? Using service test, it auto client. This is a different test. Test reload data fail. I forgot what this one was about. But this one is connecting to the using service Zool. Just look what the code is doing. Using service.zool is this one here. Now what it does is it has a function to reload data from no, it's firing. So when someone clicks reload data, it fires an event, but this is JavaScript. So something you can't simulate in ZATS. So this is something you have to test in a browser. Just mentioning this is not available in ZATS. Running out of time, using service control, reload data. So if you want to simulate this kind of click, you have to simulate the event at server side and not the click on the button, because this is a client-side listener. Okay. I think I'm always caught up in so many details. But as said, if you need to mock some variables, some services, use a variable resolver, or if you have a Spring configuration, just use a different Spring profile and exchange your live services with Spring mock services. Right? In Spring, you have full options to serve as many profiles as you like, and for every profile you have a different config, and every config will instantiate different Bean implementation classes. So you have the full flexibility there anyway. but on a ZK basis or on with ZK features, you can use a variable resolver that just returns mocks. Okay, because we don't have time. If you like Kotlin, you can condense the test cases a bit more. Just look into an example if you're interested. If Kotlin is not your thing, it's completely optional. I was just playing a bit with Kotlin here to see if we can condense the test syntax a bit more. Run these tests from command line. Can quickly do this. I just run the tests directly from command line. And since we added the test, we should have 6 tests to succeed. Now it's starting up Jetty once, and it's running all our test cases, and it failed. Oh, that's nice. What did we fail? The name is empty. Because we removed our the expected failure. That's what we wanted to work around. So now it should run. Okay, so everything succeeds. We still see a lot of exceptions here because I'm expecting a few exceptions in my test cases, and I didn't configure the logging to not log them. So we still get the failure, but the test case is expecting the exceptions, and that's why it succeeds. So everything is green. Run tests, 16 failures, 0. So command line, easy to integrate into build tools, and it's running it by itself. So what I'm always running short on is the TestCafe testing. If you have TestCafe, 7 minutes. I wonder, should we do another session about this or quickly go over it? And because this is interesting for browser testing, and I quite like the tool, I just show you what it does in an easy way. So somewhere where I have the npm run test. Now what it does is, for example, it starts TestCafe with my JavaScript test. It will run into a browser and run inside a browser. It will open. It will fail because the server is not running. So we just start the server. I have the prepared command for this because the TestCafe doesn't start the server, so you have to start it in a separate task. And you can use any way of starting a test server. It doesn't need to be the embedded Jetty. It can be a Tomcat here. So now you're free to start the application with any kind of server you want to run, because this one is now just going directly from the browser or testing with the browser APIs. So here is the window that opens automatically by TestCafe. Yeah, it will fill the form, click a button, click another button, do some assertions and succeed. Because it was very quick, there is a nice debug mode in TestCafe, which I can highly recommend. Maybe this is already a feature that will make you interested in this tool. Now, if you run this in debug mode, the test will just start up, load the page, and then just freeze. And then you have this nice preview. Here you see which line it's going to execute. And here you have a next action button in the browser. So it's overlaying some diffs or some buttons you can click. So you can step through the test case. So it's testing the main window is okay. It's there. Okay, should succeed. The text box is there. Yes. Okay. The say buy button should not be there. So visible not okay. It means it should be there. Should not be visible. That's correct. The say buy button visible not okay. Somehow this takes 2 steps. The type text. So I should see the text being entered. Yeah, works. I will take a screenshot. That's one of the test commands. Nice to preserve some progress of the test case. It will click the hello button. Yes, works. It will take another screenshot. Okay. Now it's checking that some buttons disappeared, other buttons appeared. It will check that the label is hello Robert. Yes, so very detailed. I'll click the buy button. which it also does. And then the test was okay. How is this implemented? Or what does a test case look like? And I also like this because it's very similar to a ZATS test. It's in my TestCafe project. So here's a very simple hello test. Since it's Node.js, you have these JavaScript features to import the node modules. They have this weird language about fixture. Maybe this is a word that's familiar to you. I still can't picture what a fixture is, but okay, that's my test case, my test scenario. They want to call it fixture. And it's loading this URL from the server we just started. Then I define myself my own selector, ZKJQ, which is using the JavaScript API at client side from ZK to select components by their server-side ID, because it's also available in the extended jQuery language from client side. So this is just a method to help find ZK components. So very helpful. And then I can just use the selector syntax at client side to find components very similar to the server side. Only a few exceptions. We have a different prefix because jQuery already uses the hash prefix for the DOM ID. So we use the $ for the component ID. And then you can find all these widgets. It's again just my selector functions, and I use them throughout my test. I check that the main window is visible. Something is visible. Okay, blah, 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 and test running. I would say, if you're interested in this, read the documentation. It's very good of this tool, and it has a ton of features, and also they're active developing. So I think they updated the version. It was 5 or 6 days old when I looked into this. I think last week I updated the version, and it was really just current. So it's actively developed, and it feels so much nicer than a Selenium test. And it supports multiple browsers. It has this brilliant debug mode, and you could even run it in a more internal debug mode. So you can run Chrome in debug mode. So you could step even through the code of TestCafe if you need a step-by-step analysis about what's going wrong with the test case. So a lot of details visible here, and exactly testing at the level that you need. If you want to test the browser, we test JavaScript in the browser. If you want to test the server, we test Java code at server. And if you have a farm and multiple of these running, you can perform some load tests here, or do some actual measurements about how long something takes, because these tests are running on a different process or even a different machine. You just connect to a URL in the browser. So the server side is not affected by the client overhead, by the testing case overhead. Yeah, well, the dependencies are also very, very trivial. I just have a default package JSON with almost nothing. I just have my test and my test debug script, and just the -d option, and I test in a specific browser here in Chrome, and then I'd specify the file to run. And the dependency is one dependency. So really nothing relevant here. What did I say? Yeah. And if you want to run different browsers, for example, Firefox, or both browsers at the same time, a Chrome headless, which will run in the background, it will still allow to take screenshots, but it will not pop up in front of other windows. It's nice for local development or for machines that don't have a monitor attached to them, or in all supported browsers on the specific system. And there are a ton more options to debug. You just look into the URL. And here just a quick reference about these selector syntax I mentioned, which you can also use in Selenium. So if you prefer Selenium, you can use the same kind of ZK, the JQ function of ZK, which is an extension of jQuery. So you have the jQuery selector syntax plus the extended selectors for component IDs. And that's what makes it really easy to find the components at client side in the browser. So you don't have to rely on the unique IDs and the ugly parts. And you can still select by ID, by CSS class, or by label. Yeah, so really, yeah, I would say nice feature here. So I think time is running out. Yeah, so I think as always I have to skip over things in the end. So if there's something really pressingly urgent or interesting, let us know. We might just decide and make a dedicated topic about something, about a specific, not a specific training session about a specific topic, because we're always open for ideas here. And if it fits into an hour, that's quite, it's always welcome, these kind of feedback. As I said, I will share the code and the file with the run instructions here. This time quite a little things, but always lots of details to explain. And I hope this gave an overview about what's possible, what you can expect. And if you use this, or if you have problems using it and you need some extra info, yeah, we are available to help with more things. Okay, please summarize the difference. Okay, that's all right. Yes, so ZATS for server-side testing without the browser, to test your application logic, to have complete insight on all the objects that are running in your server, Java objects, and TestCafe, Selenium, if you need to test for a specific browser. If you need to test for Chrome, Firefox, IE, whatever browser you need. I think they also have connectors for mobile browsers. Depends on how you set up your testing environment. But this is something you will find in their documentation. So, and that's why I have this this order. Use ZATS first to test as much as possible that you don't need a browser for, and only do browser-specific tests with the testing tools for browsers, because they are significantly longer to run. They are harder to maintain because browsers, they just change things. They change their APIs, and also when you change your component structure, it's just faster to run a ZATS test and see that something fails, and it just takes longer to run the TestCafe test. And maybe you find out later that something fails because the test run is a few hours. But for ZATS, you can run easily 100 tests or a few hundred tests in a few, I wouldn't say seconds, but a few minutes. You can run tests quickly depending on how fast your mocks allow you rendering the data. So yeah, that's server-side, TestCafe, Selenium, browser testing. And server-side, we mean if you need to test ZK component or composer or view model logic, or partial pages. With a Selenium test or TestCafe test, you can't test a partial include if you don't have an entry point in your application for it. But with the ZATS test, you have internal access. You can also render a ZUL file that's inside a webinf folder, if that somehow summarizes the differences between the two. So they are not competing with each other. I think you need both, but use ZATS for the for as much as possible. And where you need a browser test, then focus on the way how stuff renders, how JavaScript performs, and whatever. And yeah, whatever is browser specific. Okay, did I miss any other question? No, no other question. Okay, that's okay. So I think I'll stop the recording. So I already say bye-bye, and thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll stay here for a few minutes. If you have something you don't want to share in the recorded session, no problem. And yeah, so I'll stop the recording. Where is it here?